Rewind United is an in-depth analysis of movies chosen by our viewers. If you haven't seen this movie, I strongly urge you to watch it before seeing this review. Recently, one of our viewers made the argument in a comment on my review of Mighty Morphin Power Rangers the movie that the film is review-proof. This viewer believed that something like Power Rangers is immune to traditional narrative scrutiny because it is something else entirely. It's aware that it's cheesy. It embraces that cheese. It wears the cheese as a badge of honor. I criticized things like the consistency of the villain's plot and that the protagonist's personalities are practically interchangeable, but that movie isn't concerned with those sorts of ideas. It's about superheroes stopping bad guys, and I knew that when I reviewed it. I also said I'd review every superhero movie ever made, and I try to give as much of an in-depth analysis as humanly possible, no matter the film's intentions. But I wasn't going to pretend like I was reviewing a thought-provoking piece of storytelling either, and did that review in somewhat of a tongue-in-cheek manner. I've done everything I can think of to do with farce and parody. I've looked for subliminal messages and accidental social commentary. I've studied the art of parody and explored intent and target audience and the amount of narrative structure necessary to keep viewers engaged while just trying to make them laugh through making fun of the familiar. And I've even parodied myself while reviewing a parody by overanalyzing and straight up lying about the facts to make my bogus points work when I reviewed Superhero Movie on April Fool's Day this year. But now, I've been asked by one of our Geeks United members to give a critical analysis of 1978's Attack of the Killer Tomatoes. And I give up. I'm throwing in the towel now. If there is any film that is truly and unequivocally review-proof, it is this one. And that's probably the highest compliment I can pay it. This movie is bad. It knows it's bad. It is intentionally bad and goes out of its way to be so. I can tell you what's wrong with it, but I don't have to. It almost comes right out and tells you itself. I can dissect the lack of story structure, I can complain about the stereotypical wooden characters, the inconsistent tone, the complete disregard for pacing, the bizarre cinematography, but the film would just laugh at me in absence of its creators who would have no reason to watch a review like this, especially 30 years after the fact, and who wanted to make a B-movie with very little budget, less than $100,000, with the express purpose of making fun of other B-movies. When that's what you're going for, the absolute only conceivable way I can see a failure is if your film gets good reviews. Except for critics who know what you're doing and review you solely on intent, but those would hardly count. I mean, I'm pretty sure I'm supposed to hate this. Or maybe I'm supposed to love hating it, like it's a movie that's intentionally trying to be what some other terrible low-budget films are lucky enough to achieve, the status of so bad it's good. If Rotten Tomatoes had existed in 1978, the box would probably have made a huge proud statement of being certified rotten by Rotten Tomatoes. And yes, Attack of the Killer Tomatoes is, at present date, considered a Rotten Tomato. It currently holds a percentage of 27% fresh out of 11 reviews. So, I'm not the only madman going back and reviewing this movie. I don't think, except under duress, I would ever intentionally subject myself to this again, but looking at the history of Attack of the Killer Tomatoes, yes, it's big enough that I can actually say the history of Attack of the Killer Tomatoes, enough people fit it in the so bad it's good category that it became not simply a cult classic, but a cult franchise, something of a minor phenomenon. There are 4 films in the series, and at least a cursory glance at Amazon.com suggests that the original is the rarest and most difficult to find a copy of on DVD. The sequel, Return of the Killer Tomatoes, wasn't produced until 1988, and stars none other than George Clooney. Against my better judgment, I don't think my morbid curiosity will allow me not to watch that film. That movie seems to be the one that really spawned an interest in this bizarre franchise, and the reason I had heard of Attack of the Killer Tomatoes growing up, but had no idea it started with a movie of quite this level of quality, or lack thereof. Like The Tick, it's another underground property that had the distinction of getting a Fox cartoon series and its own video game. Considering Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and other odd and spoofy properties that mutate and personify all kinds of things that were all popular or about to become so within the next few years, it had surfaced again at just the right time. There's an entire horror subgenre about small, seemingly unassuming creatures or objects hidden in plain sight that all band together to torture or kill human beings, with movies like Gremlins and Stephen King's Maximum Overdrive. The things like that that want us dead are scarier to us because we thought we were safe around them. And in the case of something like Gremlins or the tomatoes in this movie, we even purposely have them around because they're so non-imposing, because we use them to gain some form of fulfillment, love in the case of the initially cute and cuddly Gremlins, or nourishment in the case of tomatoes. I was instantly grabbed by the text crawl that opens this film, as it reminded me that Alfred Hitchcock really made this idea popular when he made The Birds. Once again, a concept that's frightening because it uses an average, everyday creature that's all around us, constantly surrounding us, and turns our imagination against us by postulating how positively terrifying it would be if it occurred to all those birds simultaneously to go on the offensive against human beings. The text scroll says that people used to make fun of that film until in the mid-1970s it really happened. And it uses that to say that maybe the idea of anything so prominent in our everyday lives and yet so completely taken for granted suddenly coming after us is scary. And that's the most interesting idea I took from the whole film. I could have watched the first 30 seconds of the movie and left with the same amount of thoughtful consideration I had watching the whole rest of the film. Because it isn't about that at all, beyond the initial concept. And once again, it can't be. It wants to be the consummate B-movie. Throw all the rules out the window because there's no oversight, no one to stop it, nothing to lose because there's so little money in it. It might be trying to show us everything that's wrong with these kinds of films by deliberately doing everything they do, but maybe sometimes even worse. And that might be giving it too much credit. I don't know if creator Costa Dillon and director John DeBello think anything beyond the idea of tomatoes becoming sentient creatures and killing people works in this movie. I don't know if they wrote any jokes they thought were actually funny, or if they purposefully wrote jokes we'd just roll our eyes at and sneer at. But comedy is a very subjective thing. For me, a lot of the scenes that revolved around one big joke or lead up to a punchline don't work at all, but I did laugh at several throwaway gags. And I will say that I laughed at a number of points in this movie. I also looked at the clock. A lot. So let's cover the characters and plot, because that won't take long. Tomatoes become human-eating, and apparently sometimes human-raping, monsters with no explanation whatsoever. Some of them get very big, and most of the huge ones are only talked about rather than seen, and most of what they do happens off-screen. At the beginning, one of them crashes a helicopter. That must have been an added plot point on the day, because that helicopter wasn't supposed to crash. It was, in fact, only supposed to land, but the pilot accidentally crashed it. A $60,000 helicopter. It was on loan. The movie only cost $100,000. I wonder if half the budget was spent to replace that helicopter, and if they were originally going to make this for $40,000. The pilot survived, so they used the footage of the helicopter in flames, and it's the most visually exciting thing that happens in the whole movie. The plot is that everyone is incompetent. The president, the military, the police, the newspaper, everyone. And that constitutes what little social commentary is here. We have general themes of apathy and complacency, but of course, no actual message, as these people are as well developed as the tomatoes are. Our hero, Mason Dixon, yep, and it resorts to that sort of humor the whole film. Puts together a team of idiots to stop the tomatoes, only to stumble upon the solution to the problem halfway through the movie and not realize what he's got until the final 10 minutes. Turns out the tomatoes' only weakness is a horrendous popular song called Puberty Love. When they hear it, they shrink. I wonder if the end of Mars Attacks was a nod to this movie. The final giant tomato shrinks when Dixon shows him the sheet music for Puberty Love, which is admittingly kind of funny, and your guess is as good as mine for where he got his hands on that at such late notice. Dixon randomly falls in love with the leading lady, Lois Fairchild, both of whom hate each other and then change their minds for no reason, so the movie can end with a silly romantic rising climax involving an ear-splitting musical number. The third of the film, not counting the operatic Attack of the Killer Tomatoes theme, which I actually sort of like and is one of the funnier bits in the whole thing. Yes, Lois is a reporter for a newspaper, and yes, the movie felt the need not only to call her that, but to go as far as to have her recognize a guy named Clark on the street, and for him to say, up, up, and away when her back is turned. Of course, there's a Superman reference here. It's 1978. I can't get away from superheroes even if I try. At least we were spared the gratuitous nudity of a lot of low-budget B-movies. If it was really trying to be authentic, it would have done at least one, but I'm not complaining because I didn't have to see that. This definitely has one for me over the Troma films because of that. There is literally no actual story here beyond people panicking, tomatoes killing civilians, and incompetent soldiers and police trying to kill tomatoes until the last 13 minutes of the movie, when we suddenly find we've had a villain all along, who knows how to kill the tomatoes and plans to stop them only when the world is at its most desperate, thinking this will make everyone trust him and lead to his achieving world domination. And there's no explanation at all as to why only Dixon and the bad guy catch on to the tomatoes' weakness, despite puberty love being popular enough it just happens to play twice when Dixon's around tomatoes and conveniently saves him from being eaten. He and Finletter are no more competent than anybody else, and millions of people are being attacked by tomatoes. Surely somebody else would notice. Or maybe not. I mean, these people are all pretty freaking stupid. I'm not going to break down the main characters and discuss who they are and their motivations and what they're doing this movie and what they represent and anything symbolic. The characters don't matter. What matters is tomatoes making irritating noises and attacking people. A lot of them are just regular tomatoes being rolled down sidewalks and streets. The few large ones we see are people in giant tomato suits, and those are hilarious. I'm actually glad that doesn't happen too often because it's one of the funnier things we get to see, and I'm impressed it was decided not to overdo it. You don't usually want most of the action to happen off screen, but when your movie is this low budget, that kind of minimalism is welcome, instead of attempting things you just can't do. I mean, the movie does that too sometimes, but it's well aware of that. Because of its shoestring budget, it's a movie that resorts to spending most of its time having characters talk about the conflict rather than actually showing us much of it, until the very end. I have a great appreciation for minimalism, and could really appreciate that if the characters were more inherently likable, or at the very least funny beyond their gimmicks. The acting is terrible, but that's to be expected. You've got the bumbling army guy, the token black guy who's funny because he's a master of disguise and everyone always falls for it, even though he always disguises himself as dead white guys. I must admit, people actually thinking he's Hitler made me laugh. And the list goes on and on. The most cringing moments for me are when a scene takes a painfully long time to set itself up, only to exist for a cheap gag, like when a news reporter is interviewing a woman whose husband is missing. We watch as the cameraman sets up the shot, the anchor asks him if everything's ready, asks the woman if she's ready to be interviewed, etc. There's like a full minute or two of this until he finally starts talking to her, and the gag is that he's throwing her a rapid-fire list of insensitive questions like, will you miss your husband, do you think he's dead, and will you marry again? Once again, it's hard to criticize this or anything else because I don't know if the comedic timing just isn't working or if it's intentionally done badly. Again, I suspect the latter. The movie is really, really overwritten, because it's relying on its terrible actors to make the audience laugh, or groan, or maybe leave the theater. There has to be someone talking over almost every second of film, as there are very few visual jokes, though the ones that are here are some of the best of the film. This is usually accomplished by having someone talking on a radio or a television in nearly every scene. It gets old fast. It comes across like it's making fun of exposition in serious movies, so naturally, it tells us nothing worth knowing, and it's usually completely random. But it is funny sometimes. My favorite is when an announcer says some man was, quote, eaten by a bacon, lettuce, and tomato sandwich. Since the film really only has the concept of tomatoes eating people to fall back on, it's fitting that the majority of gags I thought really did work were about that, and not the generic time-filling humor that could have been in any other bad movie, like the perverted news editor. I could talk a lot more about what I thought didn't work, and probably have said more than I needed to, since this is a movie that wants to be bad. I feel like I've been fighting this movie this whole review, constantly asking myself why I'm critiquing anything with a movie that likes it that way. It's like asking Fat Albert to lose weight. If he lost weight, he wouldn't be Fat Albert anymore. It's impossible to criticize. So to conclude this review, I'm going to attack this movie by praising it. I'm pretty sure it wants to be terrible, but there are jokes I found very funny. Just as I can't be certain whether the very bad things were meant to be very bad things, I don't know if what I laughed at was actually supposed to be clever, but some of it was, I think. So here now are 10 jokes I actually really enjoyed in Attack of the Killer Tomatoes. Number 10, the unmarked carpool. Number 9, the scrolling ad for furniture that gets eaten before it can finish telling us about its amazing deals. Number 8, airheaded girls in bikinis discussing the finer points of national politics. Number 7, the general who won a medal for winning a three-legged sack race. Number 6, a Wheaties spoof called Steroids. Number 5, Richardson's completely incomprehensible villain monologue. Number 4, a giant tomato wearing earmuffs. Number 3, the whole theme song. Oh, poor Mr. Farbage. You only had such a stupid name because DeBello needed a rhyme for garbage. Number 2, army generals, scientists, and other government agents all pile into a conference room the size of a closet. It's the one scene that takes forever and is funny because it does. And number 1, Smith, the master of disguise, infiltrates the enemy camp by dressing up like a tomato. They're actually camping, and somehow he can understand them perfectly. He gets killed because he slips up and asks a tomato to hand him some ketchup. I'm not going to insult the intentional lack of integrity of this film by grading it high for succeeding at being a terrible movie. It's true that intent is important, but of course it is not everything, and truth be told, making bad things isn't that hard. But in all seriousness, it has its moments and is clearly made in good fun. There are much better and cleverer parodies before this and since. A Mel Brooks film, this is not. It's a weird experiment, and I'm glad I finally sat down and experienced it. For the last time. I'm going to give Attack of the Killer Tomatoes a 1 out of 4.